The fever hit Private First Class William Henders at 0300 on October 23, 1942. One moment he was pulling guard duty along the muddy perimeter of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the next his legs buckled beneath him. His temperature spiked to 105 degrees within an hour. The chills came next, violent enough to crack teeth despite the oppressive South Pacific heat. Corpsman Eddie Martinez found Henders curled in a foxhole, shaking so hard the mud around him rippled like water. Martinez knew the symptoms before he even checked vitals. Malaria, the same parasite that had hospitalized 8,000 Marines in just 3 months. The same disease that was putting 5 men out of action for every one wounded by Japanese bullets. Martinez reached for his medical kit and pulled out what should have been the answer. A small brown vial containing 12 yellow tablets, each stamped with the designation 0.1 grams. Atabrine, the miracle drug synthesized in German laboratories a decade earlier, manufactured by the millions in American factories, distributed to every unit fighting across the Solomon Islands. The drug that wasn't working. Martinez had watched Atabrine fail in dozens of cases over the past 6 weeks. Men took their daily pills religiously, turned yellow from the medication, suffered through nausea and headaches, and still collapsed with malarial fevers that left them delirious for days. The drug was supposed to suppress the Plasmodium parasite before it could multiply in red blood cells. Instead, Marines were getting sick anyway, and then getting sicker from the medication itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Henderson himself had been taking Atabrine since landing on Guadalcanal in early August. He dutifully swallowed his pill every morning with breakfast, watched his skin turn the color of old mustard, dealt with constant stomach cramps. And now he lay in a foxhole fighting for consciousness while his temperature climbed high enough to cause permanent brain damage. This scene repeated itself across the entire 1st Marine Division throughout September and October of 1942. The medical crisis wasn't just undermining combat effectiveness, it was threatening to hand the Solomon Islands to Imperial Japan through biological warfare that required no Japanese participation. Malaria was winning the campaign without firing a shot. The morning of November 8, 1942, Major General Alexander Patch stepped off a transport ship onto Guadalcanal's beaches and assumed command of fresh army units rotating in to relieve the devastated Marine divisions. Patch was a career infantry officer, 53 years old, a veteran of the Western Front in World War I. He'd seen typhus epidemics in the trenches, understood how disease could destroy armies faster than artillery. What Patch discovered on Guadalcanal made those World War I experiences look manageable by comparison. The Marines he was replacing weren't just exhausted from 4 months of continuous combat. They were physically broken. Nearly 70% of the 2nd Marine Division had contracted malaria. Men who'd survived Japanese banzai charges were being evacuated not from bullet wounds, but from tropical disease that hollowed them into fever-ridden skeletons. The American Division under Patch's command had arrived with full medical supplies, including abundant Atabrine stocks. Standard Army protocol called for prophylactic doses of 0.2 grams daily. Every soldier would take 1 pill each morning to maintain blood concentrations high enough to suppress the parasite before symptoms appeared. Within 3 weeks of implementing this protocol, 20% of Patch's division was incapacitated, not from malaria itself, but from the Atabrine. The medication at that dosage triggered side effects severe enough to mimic the disease it was meant to prevent. Men reported violent headaches, projectile vomiting, diarrhea that left them dehydrated in the jungle heat. Some experienced neurological symptoms, anxiety attacks, nightmares so vivid they woke screaming. General Patch himself fell ill from the Atabrine regimen. The division commander spent 3 days confined to his tent, unable to stand without assistance. While his kidneys processed a drug load his body couldn't metabolize efficiently. Patch recovered, but the experience crystallized the nightmare facing American forces in the Pacific. The cure was nearly as debilitating as the disease. Medical officers on Guadalcanal reduced the dosage to 0.05 grams daily, 1/4 the original amount. Side effects decreased, but so did efficacy. Malaria rates climbed even higher. Construction battalions that landed in December with strict Atabrine discipline still saw infection rates of 1,500 cases per 1,000 men annually. The math was brutal. Every soldier serving on Guadalcanal would contract malaria at least once. Many would get it multiple times, and Atabrine in any dosage tested so far couldn't prevent it. The underlying problem involved chemistry that field medics couldn't see and physicians didn't yet understand. Atabrine belonged to a class of synthetic compounds called quinine, developed by German chemists in 1931 as an alternative to natural quinine extracted from cinchona tree bark. When Japan captured Java and the Dutch East Indies in early 1942, they seized control of 90% of the world's quinine supply. Allied forces had no choice but to rely on synthetically produced alternatives. American pharmaceutical companies ramped up Atabrine manufacturing with impressive speed. Winthrop Chemical Company alone delivered 1.8 billion doses in 1943 and would produce 2.5 billion in 1944. The industrial capacity existed. The chemical formula worked in laboratory settings, but something fundamental was wrong with how the drug behaved inside human bodies under combat conditions. Atabrine's molecular structure gave it an unusual affinity for certain tissues. When soldiers swallowed their daily pills, the drug didn't immediately circulate through bloodstream at therapeutic concentrations. Instead, it bound preferentially to liver cells and muscle fibers, accumulating in organs before building up in plasma. This tissue sequestration meant that standard dosing protocols, borrowed from quinine regimens developed decades earlier, were fundamentally inappropriate for the new synthetic drug. At 0.2 grams daily, soldiers were loading their livers faster than their bloodstreams. The medication piled up in tissues, causing toxic side effects, while never reaching the blood concentrations necessary to suppress Plasmodium parasites multiplying in red blood cells. At reduced doses of 0.05 grams, the drug accumulated slowly enough to avoid severe toxicity, but too slowly to achieve therapeutic plasma levels before soldiers got exposed to infected mosquitoes. The result was the worst possible outcome. Troops experienced medication side effects without receiving prophylactic benefit. They turned yellow, got sick from the pills, and contracted malaria anyway. The Japanese didn't need to bomb Henderson Field when tropical disease was destroying American combat strength more efficiently than any air raid. By December 1942, when the Marine divisions finally evacuated to Australia for rehabilitation, the malaria statistics told a devastating story. Combined Allied forces on Guadalcanal had lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, with another 4,000 wounded. But several thousand more had been evacuated due to tropical diseases, primarily malaria. For every American killed by Japanese fire, 3 were rendered combat ineffective by parasites transmitted through mosquito bites. The irony cut deeper when intelligence officers examined captured Japanese medical records. Enemy forces were suffering comparable malaria rates, sometimes worse than American units. Both sides were being destroyed by the same biological opponent. The campaign was becoming a grotesque endurance contest to see which army could function longer while 2/3 of its soldiers cycled through malarial fevers. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations from Pearl Harbor, received the Guadalcanal disease reports with barely contained fury. The United States was winning the industrial war, outproducing Japan in every measurable category of war material. American shipyards were launching aircraft carriers faster than Japanese pilots could sink them. American factories were building bombers and tanks that arrived in the Pacific by the hundreds. But none of that industrial might mattered if soldiers couldn't stand upright long enough to fire their weapons. Malaria was threatening to turn the island-hopping strategy into a strategic dead end. You couldn't capture and hold territory if your garrison forces spent months recovering in hospitals before returning to combat effectiveness. The crisis reached Washington in early January 1943 through medical reports that painted an unsustainable picture. Army Medical Corps statisticians compiled data from every Pacific theater engagement between August and December. The numbers were unambiguous. In highly malarious areas, American forces were experiencing disease casualty rates 5 times higher than combat losses. Malaria alone caused more troop evacuations than all Japanese weapons combined. Secretary of War Henry Stimson convened an emergency meeting of the Committee on Medical Research, a wartime organization coordinating scientific resources for military applications. The committee operated under the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the same bureaucracy managing the Manhattan Project's atomic weapons program. The malaria crisis received comparable priority. The problem facing military medicine in January 1943 wasn't creating new drugs. Atabrine worked in controlled settings. Laboratory tests proved its effectiveness against Plasmodium parasites. Animal studies showed proper suppression at calculable dosages. The disconnect came when battlefield conditions diverged from laboratory conditions, when stressed, malnourished, sleep-deprived soldiers in tropical combat zones didn't metabolize medications the same way healthy research subjects did in New York hospitals. What the military needed wasn't better chemistry. It needed better pharmacology, the science of understanding how drugs behaved inside living organisms under real-world conditions. That required physicians who could bridge the gap between chemical theory and biological reality, who could measure what was actually happening when a soldier swallowed an Atabrine tablet versus what was supposed to happen according to manufacturer specifications. The Committee on Medical Research identified one researcher whose work suggested he might solve the Atabrine paradox. His name wasn't widely known outside academic medicine, and he'd never served in combat or even visited the Pacific Theater. But his experimental approach to drug research represented something fundamentally new in pharmacology, and the military was desperate enough to gamble on unproven methodologies. Dr. James Augustine Shannon was 38 years old in January 1943, Director of Medical Research at Goldwater Memorial Hospital on Welfare Island in New York City. The hospital specialized in chronic diseases, not military medicine. Shannon's background was in kidney physiology, studying how organs filtered blood and excreted waste products. Nothing about his resume suggested expertise in tropical diseases or battlefield medicine. But Shannon had spent the previous 12 years revolutionizing how physicians thought about drugs in the bloodstream. He'd pioneered techniques for precisely measuring chemical concentrations in body fluids, transforming renal physiology from qualitative observation into quantitative science. His laboratory could measure exact amounts of compounds circulating through blood plasma, could track how quickly kidneys eliminated them, could calculate steady-state concentrations that determined whether medications worked or failed. Shannon's approach, which colleagues called the gospel of blood levels, rested on a deceptively simple premise. A drug only worked if it reached the target tissue at effective concentrations for sufficient duration. Everything else, manufacturing quality, dosing schedules, pharmaceutical purity, mattered only insofar as it affected blood levels. If you couldn't measure blood concentrations precisely, you were prescribing medications blindly and hoping for the best. The Committee on Medical Research gave Shannon an assignment that would determine whether American forces could sustain operations in the Pacific. Figure out why Atabrine was failing on Guadalcanal. Develop a dosing protocol that worked in combat conditions. Do it fast enough to matter before the next major offensive. Shannon assembled his research team in the basement of Goldwater Hospital's Building D during February 1943. The group included Dr. Bernard Brodie, an organic chemist from Montreal who specialized in drug metabolism, Dr. Sidney Udenfriend, a recent graduate student with expertise in analytical chemistry, Dr. Robert Berliner, a colleague from Shannon's kidney physiology work, and several young physicians pulled from other research programs across New York University's medical system. The team's first challenge involved measurement technology that didn't quite exist yet. Standard. Laboratory techniques could detect Atabrine in blood samples at high concentrations, but lacked the sensitivity to measure therapeutic levels accurately. The drug absorbed light at specific wavelengths, allowing spectrophotometric analysis in principle. But distinguishing Atabrine molecules from other compounds in blood plasma required precision beyond what most hospital laboratories could achieve. Brodie and Udenfriend spent weeks developing a modified fluorescence technique. Atabrine glowed faintly when exposed to ultraviolet light at particular wavelengths. By measuring that fluorescent emission precisely, they could calculate drug concentrations down to incredibly small amounts. The method required custom-built equipment, modified microscope optics, and careful calibration, but it worked. For the first time, physicians could measure exactly how much Atabrine was circulating in a patient's bloodstream at any given moment. With measurement capability established, Shannon designed experiments that field commanders would have considered insane if they'd known the details. He recruited volunteers from Goldwater's chronic disease patients, many suffering from conditions unrelated to malaria. Shannon administered various Atabrine doses, then drew blood samples at regular intervals, tracking how concentrations built up in plasma over hours and days. The data revealed what was happening to soldiers on Guadalcanal. At standard doses, Atabrine entered the bloodstream slowly, most of it diverting into liver tissue and muscle cells before achieving therapeutic plasma levels. Tissue binding created a reservoir effect. The drug accumulated in organs, then leaked back into circulation gradually, as tissue concentrations equilibrated with blood concentrations. This explained the toxicity problems. High initial doses overwhelmed the liver's capacity to process the drug, causing side effects before plasma levels climbed high enough to suppress malaria. Lower doses avoided immediate toxicity, but never built up sufficient blood concentrations to work prophylactically. Soldiers were stuck in a pharmaceutical catch-22, where effective doses caused unacceptable side effects and tolerable doses provided no protection. Shannon's solution was counterintuitive enough that military physicians initially rejected it as dangerous. Instead of consistent daily doses, Shannon proposed a loading regimen followed by maintenance doses. Give soldiers a large initial dose, 1 gram of Atabrine over the first day, deliberately saturating tissue binding sites. Then drop to tiny daily maintenance doses of 0.1 grams, just enough to replace what kidneys eliminated. The loading dose would fill up liver and muscle reservoirs quickly, causing temporary side effects, but pushing plasma levels into the therapeutic range within 24 hours. Once tissues were saturated, the small maintenance doses would maintain steady blood concentrations without continued toxicity. The drug would circulate through bloodstream, instead of accumulating in organs. The proposal terrified Army Medical Corps bureaucrats. Shannon was recommending doses 10 times higher than standard protocols for the first day, potentially causing severe reactions in troops already stressed by combat conditions. If soldiers died from Atabrine toxicity because Shannon miscalculated the loading dose, it would destroy any remaining confidence in chemical prophylaxis. But Shannon had the data. His Goldwater experiments showed that loading doses, while causing temporary discomfort, didn't produce lasting toxicity. Once plasma levels stabilized, side effects disappeared, while prophylactic efficacy remained high. And critically, the new regimen worked for the right reasons. It achieved therapeutic blood concentrations that suppressed Plasmodium parasites before they could multiply to disease-causing levels. By spring of 1943, Shannon's team had presented the Army Medical Corps with complete documentation. New dosing rules for Atabrine based on measured blood levels rather than theoretical calculations. Protocols designed around how the drug actually behaved in human bodies, rather than how pharmaceutical textbooks said it should behave. The military had two choices: continue using protocols that demonstrably failed, losing thousands of soldiers weekly to malaria while existing drug supplies sat unused in warehouses, or gamble on an untested dosing regimen developed by a kidney physiologist who'd never treated tropical disease, implementing it across every unit fighting in the Pacific, and hoping Shannon's fluorescence measurements translated into battlefield results. The decision would determine whether American forces could continue offensive operations in the South Pacific, or whether disease would force a strategic pause that handed initiative back to Japan. Thousands of soldiers in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were already getting sick, already evacuating to field hospitals that couldn't handle the patient load. Whatever Washington decided needed to happen immediately. The Committee on Medical Research endorsed Shannon's protocols in May 1943 and ordered implementation across Pacific theater operations. Military physicians began distributing new Atabrine guidelines to medical officers serving from Australia to the Aleutians. 1 gram loading dose, then 0.1 grams daily maintenance. Enforce compliance strictly, no exceptions. And one more critical instruction that field commanders initially resisted. Shannon had discovered that soldiers were discarding their Atabrine pills rather than swallowing them. Rumours circulated that the medication caused impotence and sterility, unfounded claims but persistent enough to undermine drug discipline. Men would accept their daily pill from corpsmen, then spit it out once supervision disappeared. Shannon demanded supervised administration. Medical personnel would stand in chow lines during meals, personally distributing pills and watching each soldier swallow them. In some units, corpsmen were ordered to inspect mouths afterward, ensuring tablets had been actually ingested rather than hidden under tongues. The approach felt humiliating to troops who'd faced Japanese banzai charges without flinching, but Shannon was adamant. Blood levels only worked if soldiers actually took the medication. The new protocols reached forward units throughout the summer of 1943, just as American forces prepared for the next island assaults. New Georgia, Bougainville, the Gilbert Islands. Every offensive would put soldiers into malarial jungles, where, based on Guadalcanal statistics, 2/3 would normally contract the disease within 4 months. Shannon's loading doses and maintenance regimens were about to face the only test that mattered. Not laboratory measurements or hospital studies, but combat conditions where failure meant evacuation and success meant soldiers stayed on their feet long enough to win. What happened next would validate Shannon's unorthodox pharmacology or prove that battlefield medicine remained too complex for chemical solutions. Either way, the results would come fast. The first large-scale test of Shannon's protocols began on June 30th, 1943, when the 43rd Infantry Division landed on Rendover Island as part of the New Georgia campaign. The division's medical officer, Colonel Harold Morrison, had received Shannon's new Atabrine guidelines 3 weeks earlier, along with explicit orders to implement them immediately upon landing. Morrison was skeptical. He'd served as a battalion surgeon during the Guadalcanal campaign, had watched Atabrine fail repeatedly at multiple dosages. The idea that changing the timing and amount would suddenly make the drug effective struck him as wishful thinking by laboratory physicians who'd never treated malaria under field conditions. But orders were orders, and Morrison had seen enough disease casualties to try anything that might work. The 43rd Division began Shannon's loading regimen on July 1st. Every soldier received 1 gram of Atabrine on the first day, administered in divided doses to reduce immediate gastric distress. Medical personnel distributed 0.25 gram tablets 4 times throughout the day, ensuring soldiers took all 4 doses under direct supervision. The side effects arrived predictably. Within hours, hundreds of soldiers reported nausea, headaches, and stomach cramps. Some vomited shortly after taking the medication. The division's sick call rates spiked on days 2 and 3 as the loading dose worked through systems. Morrison filed daily reports noting that approximately 15% of the division experienced temporary discomfort significant enough to interfere with duty performance. But by day 4, something changed. The acute side effects diminished as tissue saturation completed and plasma levels stabilized. Soldiers who'd felt miserable for 72 hours reported that symptoms disappeared almost as quickly as they'd arrived. The maintenance doses of 0.1 grams daily caused minimal discomfort, nothing like the persistent nausea that had plagued troops on Guadalcanal, taking 0.2 grams continuously. More importantly, malaria rates stayed remarkably low. The 43rd Division spent 6 weeks on Rendover conducting operations in conditions identical to Guadalcanal: dense jungle, stagnant water everywhere, clouds of Anopheles mosquitoes at dusk. Historical data suggested they should have seen infection rates approaching 1,000 cases per 1,000 men annually, roughly 80 casualties weekly in a full-strength division. Colonel Morrison's medical reports for July showed 43 confirmed malaria cases in the entire division. August brought 61 cases. These weren't dramatic reductions. They were near-complete elimination of a disease that had devastated every previous American unit operating in comparable environments. The Atabrine was finally working. Morrison conducted detailed interviews with soldiers who did contract malaria despite the prophylaxis. Almost universally, they admitted to missing doses or deliberately avoiding the medication. The handful who claimed religious compliance often couldn't remember the last time they'd actually swallowed their daily pill under supervision. When Morrison instituted stricter enforcement, requiring corpsmen to visually confirm ingestion, even those breakthrough cases dropped to near zero. The data from Rendova reached Shannon's Goldwater laboratory by August through military medical channels. He immediately requested blood samples from randomly selected troops in the field, wanting to confirm that plasma concentrations matched his predictions. Transport times and storage issues made direct measurement difficult, but the samples that arrived showed Atabrine levels clustering around exactly where Shannon's models suggested they should be. For the first time since American forces had entered the Pacific theater, a medical intervention was performing better in combat than in laboratory settings. Battlefield results were exceeding controlled study outcomes. Shannon's gospel of blood levels had translated into soldiers who stayed healthy enough to fight. Additional divisions implementing the new protocols throughout summer and fall of 1943 produced similar results. The 25th Infantry Division in the Solomon Islands, the 37th Infantry Division in New Georgia, Marine units preparing for the Gilbert Islands assault. Everywhere Shannon's loading and maintenance regimen was enforced properly. Malaria rates plummeted by 80 to 90% compared to historical baselines. The transformation was so dramatic that some medical officers suspected the reporting was fraudulent. How could a simple dosage change produce results that different from previous experience? The Committee on Medical Research dispatched inspection teams to verify the data independently, concerned that field commanders might be inflating success rates to avoid criticism of earlier failures. The inspectors found that, if anything, official reports understated the improvement. Units following Shannon's protocols with strict drug discipline were virtually eliminating malaria as a combat factor. The disease hadn't disappeared entirely, soldiers still got infected occasionally, but the prophylaxis reduced clinical malaria to manageable background rates comparable to any other minor illness. Mosquitoes still bit, parasites still entered bloodstreams, but Atabrine at therapeutic plasma levels prevented them from multiplying to disease-causing numbers. The mechanism involved biochemistry that Shannon's team was still working to understand fully. Plasmodium parasites required specific liver enzymes to complete their reproductive cycle inside human cells. Atabrine at adequate blood concentrations interfered with those enzymatic pathways, essentially sterilizing the parasites before they could produce the massive cellular replications that triggered malarial fevers. Earlier dosing protocols had maintained Atabrine levels just below the threshold necessary to disrupt the parasites effectively. The difference between failure and success was relatively small in absolute terms, perhaps 20% higher plasma concentration. But that 20% gap made the difference between soldiers collapsing with 105-degree fevers and soldiers remaining asymptomatic despite parasite exposure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By October 1943, Shannon's Atabrine protocols had become standard operating procedure across every American unit serving in malarious regions. The Army Medical Corps incorporated the loading and maintenance regimen into official field manuals. Medical schools began teaching Shannon's principles of therapeutic drug monitoring as core pharmacology curriculum. What had been an experimental approach in February became doctrine by fall. The statistics told a story that even skeptical physicians couldn't dismiss. During the first year of Pacific operations from August 1942 through July 1943, malaria caused approximately 5 casualties for every combat casualty. In some units, the ratio reached 10 to 1. Disease was destroying American offensive capability faster than any Japanese defensive strategy. After Shannon's protocols were implemented in summer 1943, that ratio inverted. Combat casualties exceeded disease casualties in nearly every major engagement from Tarawa through the Philippines. Malaria went from the primary cause of troop loss to a minor footnote in medical reports. The disease that had threatened to make the Pacific theater strategically unwinnable became a solved problem through pharmaceutical chemistry properly applied. The Japanese faced no comparable solution. Their medical research programs lacked the analytical tools Shannon's team had developed. Japanese physicians continued using quinine when they could obtain it, and when quinine supplies ran out, they had no effective alternatives. As the war progressed and Japanese supply lines collapsed, their malaria rates climbed toward catastrophic levels. Intelligence reports from captured documents showed that by late 1944, some Japanese units in New Guinea and the Philippines had 90% of their troops suffering from malaria or other tropical diseases. They couldn't evacuate soldiers for treatment. They couldn't resupply medications that worked. Japanese forces were literally dying from diseases that American troops now prevented with daily pills that cost pennies to manufacture. The strategic implications extended beyond individual battles. American commanders could plan multi-month campaigns in tropical regions, knowing their forces would maintain combat effectiveness throughout. Japan had to factor inevitable disease attrition into every defensive calculation, had to assume their garrison forces would lose half their strength to illness before combat even began. That asymmetry compounded every other material advantage the United States possessed. The Marshall Islands invasion in January 1944 demonstrated the transformation. American forces landed on Kwajalein with full implementation of Shannon's Atabrine protocols, plus environmental controls including DDT spraying to reduce mosquito populations. Over 12,000 troops operated in tropical conditions for 6 weeks. Total malaria cases, 17. Less than 0.2% infection rate. For comparison, during an equivalent 6-week period on Guadalcanal, 18 months earlier, 12,000 troops would have generated approximately 1,500 malaria cases requiring hospitalization. Shannon's pharmacology had improved combat effectiveness by an order of magnitude through the simple expedient of keeping soldiers healthy. The broader medical community began recognizing Shannon's achievement as the war progressed. His approach to drug dosing based on measured blood levels represented a paradigm shift in how physicians thought about medications. Before Shannon, dosing was largely empirical. Doctors prescribed amounts that historical experience suggested worked, then adjusted based on observed patient responses. If a drug didn't work at a given dose, you either increased the amount or tried something different. Shannon proved that empirical dosing missed the fundamental question. The drug had to reach the target tissue at effective concentrations. Everything else was irrelevant. If you couldn't measure where the drug went and how much arrived, you were guessing. His quantitative approach transformed pharmacology from an art into a science. The techniques Shannon's team developed during the malaria project had applications far beyond tropical disease. The fluorescence methods Brody and Udenfriend created for measuring Atabrine could be adapted to measure dozens of other compounds in blood. The loading dose concept applied to any medication with significant tissue binding. The principle of therapeutic drug monitoring became standard practice across clinical medicine. Shannon's wartime work also led directly to development of chloroquine, a related antimalarial compound, with even better efficacy and fewer side effects than Atabrine. American chemists captured the formula from German sources in North Africa during 1943. Shannon's team conducted the pharmacological studies that determined proper dosing regimens, and chloroquine became the antimalarial drug of choice for several decades after the war, until resistant Plasmodium strains eventually evolved. The Atabrine success rescued American strategy in the Pacific at a moment when disease threatened to stall offensive operations indefinitely. But for the soldiers who'd suffered through Guadalcanal and early New Guinea campaigns, Shannon's breakthrough came too late. Those men had contracted malaria before effective prophylaxis existed, and many would fight recurring infections for years. The parasite that caused most relapses, Plasmodium vivax, had an insidious characteristic. It could form dormant stages in the liver that persisted for months or years after initial infection. Atabrine suppressed active parasites in the bloodstream, but didn't eliminate the dormant liver forms. Soldiers who'd gotten infected on Guadalcanal experienced periodic relapses when those dormant parasites reactivated, triggering new episodes of fever and weakness. Thousands of soldiers were shipped to convalescent facilities in Fiji, New Caledonia, and Australia after evacuation from the same. Solomon Islands. Some remained on Atabrine suppression continuously, taking daily maintenance doses that prevented relapses as long as medication continued. When suppressive therapy was withdrawn, the dormant parasites reactivated, and clinical malaria returned within weeks. Medical researchers conducted studies on these relapsing cases, trying to determine how long suppressive treatment needed to continue before soldiers could safely discontinue medication. The studies involved controversial protocols. Some soldiers were deliberately taken off Atabrine to observe relapse rates, to measure how quickly their immune systems could clear the persistent liver infections without pharmaceutical assistance. The experiments backfired in many cases. Men who'd been healthy on suppressive therapy suffered severe, repeated malarial attacks once medication stopped. Some lost significant weight, developed chronic organ damage, battled monthly fever cycles that left them physically and mentally exhausted. The research produced useful data about parasite biology and drug mechanisms, but at a human cost that would be considered unethical by later medical standards. These involuntary human subjects, soldiers used as guinea pigs in malaria research, represented a dark counterpoint to Shannon's achievement. His protocols saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers from contracting malaria in the first place. But the men who'd gotten infected before those protocols existed became experimental subjects in studies that prioritized scientific knowledge over individual welfare. The full details of those malaria experiments remained classified for decades. Only in the early 21st century did historians working through National Archives documents uncover the extent of testing conducted on both soldiers and civilian psychiatric patients during the war. Thousands of men, many without informed consent, became research subjects in the urgent race to understand and defeat malaria. Part 3. The Cost of Truth. Dr. James Shannon never visited Guadalcanal. He never treated a soldier suffering from malarial fever, never stood in a jungle clearing watching corpsmen distribute pills to exhausted infantrymen. His contribution to the Pacific War happened entirely in a hospital basement in New York City, measuring fluorescence in blood samples and calculating dosing schedules on paper, but the impact of that laboratory work exceeded most battlefield victories in strategic significance. Shannon's Atabrine protocols didn't win individual engagements. They made sustained offensive operations possible in regions where disease had previously made long-term military presence unsustainable. Without effective malaria prophylaxis, the island-hopping campaign that eventually brought American forces to Japan's doorstep would have stalled in the Solomon Islands. The statistics from the war's final 2 years demonstrated the transformation. Between August 1943 and August 1945, American forces conducted major operations across the Pacific from the Gilbert Islands through Okinawa. Millions of soldiers and Marines served in highly malarious environments. Total malaria casualties declined to approximately 4% of total troop strength, compared to 60+% infection rates during the first year of Pacific operations. That difference represented roughly 500,000 soldiers who remained combat effective instead of lying in field hospitals fighting parasitic infections. 500,000 man-months of combat capability that wouldn't have existed without Shannon's pharmacological breakthrough. The strategic value was incalculable. The Winthrop Chemical Company's production statistics illustrated the scale of implementation. 1.8 billion Atabrine doses manufactured in 1943, 2.5 billion in 1944. Those weren't just impressive manufacturing numbers. Each dose represented a soldier taking a pill under supervised administration, maintaining therapeutic blood levels, staying healthy enough to fight. Shannon received the Presidential Medal of Merit in 1948 for his malaria research, awarded personally by President Harry Truman. The citation credited him with developing protocols that protected millions of American troops from tropical disease. Shannon accepted the medal quietly, characteristically modest about work he considered simply applied pharmacology. After the war, Shannon joined the Squibb Institute for Medical Research as director, then moved to the National Institutes of Health in 1949. He became NIH director in 1955, serving for 13 years during a period of massive expansion in federal medical research funding. The NIH budget grew at over 20% annually under Shannon's leadership. New institutes were established covering child health, environmental sciences, and general medical sciences. Shannon's wartime experience with Atabrine influenced how he approached NIH's research priorities. He pushed for programs that studied basic drug mechanisms, funded research into how medications were metabolized and eliminated, supported development of analytical tools that could measure trace quantities of compounds in biological samples. The pharmacological revolution he'd pioneered during the malaria crisis became NIH policy, affecting every aspect of biomedical research. The main NIH administration building in Bethesda, Maryland, was renamed the James Shannon Building in 1983, honoring his transformative influence on American medical research. Shannon died in 1994 at age 90, having witnessed his wartime pharmacology become the foundation for modern drug development. But Shannon's legacy extended beyond institutional achievements and administrative leadership. The gospel of blood levels, the principle that drugs must reach target tissues at measured concentrations to work effectively, revolutionized how physicians prescribed medications and how pharmaceutical companies designed drugs. Every modern therapeutic drug monitoring program, from antibiotics to chemotherapy, traces its origins to techniques Shannon developed measuring Atabrine in malaria patients. The soldiers Shannon saved never knew his name. The Marines who landed on Tarawa in November 1943, taking their loading doses of Atabrine and staying healthy throughout the brutal three-day battle, had no idea their prophylaxis came from a New York physiologist's laboratory experiments. The army troops who fought through New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa took their daily Atabrine pills as routine as cleaning their rifles, unaware those pills represented a scientific breakthrough that had turned an unsolvable medical crisis into a managed inconvenience. Private First Class William Henderson, the Marine who'd collapsed with malarial fever on Guadalcanal in October 1942, was evacuated to a field hospital and eventually recovered. He spent 3 months in Australia, undergoing treatment and rehabilitation before returning to duty. Henderson's service record showed 5 additional malarial relapses between 1943 and 1946, each requiring hospitalization and suppressive therapy. He was one of thousands who'd been infected before Shannon's protocols could prevent it, who lived with recurring disease for years afterward. Henderson received no Purple Heart for his malaria, no combat decoration for surviving tropical disease that permanently damaged his health. The military classified disease casualties differently from combat wounds, even though malaria killed and incapacitated soldiers just as effectively as bullets. Henderson returned to civilian life in 1946, worked in construction in Ohio for 30 years, died in 1981 at age 62. His death certificate listed contributing factors including chronic liver disease and recurring infections, both potentially related to persistent malaria from Guadalcanal. He never knew that his suffering in 1942 had been preventable, that a proper Atabrine regimen implemented just months earlier could have spared him decades of health problems. The irony of timing defined the malaria crisis across the Pacific. Shannon's breakthrough came in spring 1943, but American forces had been fighting in malarious regions since August 1942. 8 months during which proper Atabrine dosing could have prevented thousands of infections. 8 months when the pharmaceutical solution existed but wasn't being applied correctly because nobody had measured blood levels to determine what correctly meant. Those 8 months saw the worst disease casualty rates of the entire Pacific War. Guadalcanal, early New Guinea, the Papua Campaign. Soldiers suffered and died from malaria, not because medicine lacked effective drugs, but because medical practice hadn't caught up with pharmaceutical chemistry. The pills were there, the manufacturing capacity existed. What was missing was Shannon's quantitative pharmacology that showed how to use them properly. This pattern repeated throughout military medical history. Penicillin existed for years before physicians understood optimal dosing. Blood transfusion techniques were developed long before proper typing and storage protocols made them safely deployable. Medical breakthroughs often preceded the practical knowledge of how to implement them effectively. Shannon's contribution wasn't discovering a new drug, it was discovering how to use an existing drug in ways that actually worked. The broader lesson from the Atabrine crisis involved the difference between having solutions and applying them correctly. America's pharmaceutical industry had produced billions of doses of effective antimalarial medication, but production capacity was worthless if field dosing protocols rendered the medication ineffective or toxic. Shannon bridged that gap between chemical capability and medical practice through rigorous measurement and quantitative analysis. His approach contrasted sharply with earlier medical tradition that relied on clinical experience and empirical observation. Pre-Shannon pharmacology involved giving drugs at doses that seemed to work based on historical practice, then adjusting based on patient outcomes. Shannon demanded actual measurement, quantitative data showing what was happening inside patient bodies, calculations proving that blood levels reached therapeutic ranges. This transition from empirical medicine to quantitative medicine represented one of the 20th century's most important advances in clinical practice. It enabled modern pharmaceuticals that required precise dosing. It made possible complex drug regimens involving multiple medications that needed careful coordination. It transformed medicine from guesswork informed by experience into science guided by measurement. The malaria crisis of 1942 and 43 accelerated that transformation under wartime pressure. Shannon didn't have years to develop his techniques through careful academic research. He had months to solve a problem that was destroying American combat capability in the Pacific. The urgency forced rapid innovation that might have taken decades in peacetime academic settings. That wartime pressure also enabled medical experiments that crossed ethical boundaries. The soldiers used as test subjects in Fiji, deliberately taken off Atabrine to observe relapse rates, didn't volunteer for that research. The psychiatric patients infected with malaria strains to test potential new drugs didn't provide informed consent. Shannon's achievement came embedded in a larger program that treated human subjects as experimental resources rather than autonomous individuals deserving protection. Modern medical ethics considers those World War II malaria experiments to be clear violations of fundamental principles. Research subjects must understand what they're participating in and must have the option to decline. Vulnerable populations like hospitalized psychiatric patients require special protections against coercive experimentation. The urgency of wartime medical needs doesn't justify overriding individual autonomy and informed consent. Yet the knowledge gained from those ethically problematic experiments contributed to antimalarial drugs that have since saved millions of lives worldwide. Chloroquine, developed partially through testing on non-consenting subjects during the war, became the primary malaria treatment across Africa and Asia for decades. Should that knowledge be discarded because it originated in ethically tainted research? Can physicians use treatments validated through unethical means if those treatments benefit current patients? These questions remain unresolved in medical ethics. Shannon's legitimate scientific achievement exists alongside a darker history of human experimentation that used soldiers and psychiatric patients as laboratory subjects. Both aspects shaped modern malaria treatment and broader pharmaceutical development. Disentangling the legitimate science from the ethical violations requires confronting uncomfortable historical truths about how medical progress sometimes advances through morally questionable means. The soldiers who took Atabrine during the war's final 2 years benefited from protocols developed partly through studies on troops who hadn't consented to experimental participation. They stayed healthy, avoided malaria, survived the Pacific campaign at higher rates than earlier units. That benefit came at a cost paid by other soldiers who suffered repeated malarial attacks while serving as unwilling research subjects. Dr. Shannon himself focused on the pharmacological science, on measuring blood levels and calculating the dosing schedules. Whether he knew the full extent of human subject testing conducted by other researchers in the broader malaria program remains unclear from historical records. His published work referenced data from various clinical trials, without detailing how those trials obtained volunteers or whether subjects understood their participation. What's certain is that Shannon's quantitative approach to pharmacology saved hundreds of thousands of lives and became the foundation for modern therapeutic drug monitoring. His gospel of blood levels transformed how physicians think about medications. Every prescription written today for drugs requiring careful dose adjustment, every antibiotic regimen timed to maintain therapeutic concentrations, every chemotherapy protocol calculated to maximize efficacy while minimizing toxicity descends directly from techniques Shannon pioneered measuring Atabrine in malaria patients. The final irony of Shannon's wartime achievement involves scale and recognition. The Manhattan Project, operating under comparable secrecy with similar wartime urgency, produced atomic weapons that killed approximately 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That project became one of history's most famous scientific endeavors, its leaders, household names, its physics breakthrough taught in every school. Shannon's Malaria Project, operating through the same Office of Scientific Research and Development with equivalent strategic importance, saved comparable numbers of lives and receives almost no public recognition. Most Americans have never heard of James Shannon. His Atabrine protocols aren't taught in history classes. The pharmacological revolution he pioneered remains invisible to everyone except medical professionals who use its principles daily without knowing their origin. Perhaps this reflects how societies remember different types of achievement. Weapons that destroy through dramatic explosive power capture imagination more than pills that protect through measured blood chemistry. The visible spectacle of mushroom clouds overshadows the quiet effectiveness of soldiers taking daily medication and staying healthy. Shannon's triumph was fundamentally undramatic, a laboratory success that translated into soldiers not getting sick, victories defined by absence rather than presence. But measured in lives saved and strategic impact on the Pacific War's outcome, Shannon's contribution equaled or exceeded most celebrated military innovations of World War II. Without effective malaria prophylaxis, American forces couldn't have sustained the island-hopping campaign that brought them to Japan's home islands. The war in the Pacific might have dragged on for additional years, costing hundreds of thousands more casualties on both sides. Shannon's legacy lives on in every soldier deployed to tropical regions who takes antimalarial medication calculated to maintain therapeutic blood levels. In every malaria treatment program across Africa and Asia that uses dosing protocols derived from his wartime research. In every pharmaceutical company that measures drug metabolism and designs dosing regimens based on quantitative pharmacokinetics. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 didn't have Shannon's protocols. They got sick. They died from treatable disease. They evacuated with infections that haunted them for years. The Marines who landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945 took their Atabrine with loading doses and maintenance regimens precisely calculated to maintain plasma levels between 30 and 50 micrograms per milliliter. They stayed healthy. They fought. They won. That difference, measured in micrograms of drug per milliliter of blood, determined whether American soldiers could operate effectively in the tropical Pacific, whether they could take and hold islands across thousands of miles of ocean, whether they could sustain the offensive operations that eventually ended the war. Dr. James Shannon achieved that difference by doing what he'd always done, measuring precisely, calculating carefully, insisting that drugs only worked if they reached their targets at correct concentrations for sufficient duration, applying kidney physiology principles to tropical disease pharmacology, and discovering that the gospel of blood levels solved problems that empirical medicine couldn't address. The yellow tablets that saved a Pacific campaign came from German laboratories, American factories, and a New York physiologist who understood that chemistry only mattered if you measured where it went. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.